The dust in the Sierra Madre Mountains does not just sit on the ground. It gets under your skin, into your teeth, and inside your lungs. In the remote hamlet of La Tuna, tucked deep within the municipality of Badiraguato in Sinaloa, poverty was not an abstract idea. It was the very air people breathed. There were no paved roads, no running water, no electricity, and no schools worth speaking of. Families lived in small, mud-brick shacks clinging to the steep hillsides, cut off from the rest of Mexico by jagged peaks and harsh terrain. It was into this harsh, isolated world that Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera was born in the mid-1950s. To the few dozen families living in La Tuna, he was just another mouth to feed in a region where survival was a daily struggle. His family was poor, even by the desperate standards of the Sinaloa Highlands. His mother, Maria Consuelo Loera Perez, was a devoutly religious woman who tried to instill faith and order in a home defined by scarcity. His father, Emilio Guzman Bastillos, was an amapalero, a small-time peasant farmer who cultivated opium poppies and marijuana in the hidden valleys surrounding their home. Emilio was a hard, bitter man whose anger was fueled by heavy drinking. In the mountains, physical violence was common, and Emilio ruled his household with a violent hand. Young Joaquin, the eldest of several surviving children, bore the brunt of his father's temper. Defiance or failure to work was met with swift beatings. Joaquin learned early to read the shifts in his father's mood, developing a sharp, watchful eye that noticed every subtle movement in his environment, a trait that would define his entire life. Work began almost as soon as Joaquin could walk. There was no room for childhood play in La Tuna. By the time he was 7 or 8 years old, Joaquin was rising before dawn to work the fields alongside his father. The work was exhausting. In the dry season, the sun beat down mercilessly on the terraced hillsides. In the rainy season, the soil turned into thick, clinging mud that made every step a burden. The crop that mattered most was the amapola, the red poppy flower. Cultivating poppies required meticulous, back-breaking labor. After the flowers bloomed and the petals fell away, the green seed pods had to be scored by hand with small, sharp blades. Workers walked down the narrow rows, carefully slicing the skin of the pods without cutting too deep. Over the course of the day, a thick, milky white sap oozed from the cuts, hardening into a sticky brown gum as it dried in the mountain air. The next morning, Joaquin and his brothers scraped the raw opium paste off the pods using blunt knives, collecting it in small tin cans. It was tedious, delicate work for small hands, but it taught Joaquin the fundamental economy of his birthplace. In Badiraguato, corn and beans kept you alive, but opium was the only thing that brought in actual cash. The Mexican government in Mexico City felt thousands of miles away, completely irrelevant to life in the mountains. The only authority that mattered was the land, the family, and the buyers who drove up the winding dirt roads to purchase the sticky brown gum. Despite the daily grind in the fields, the money Emilio earned rarely helped the family. Emilio would take the proceeds from the opium harvest to the larger towns down in the valley, spending most of it on alcohol, women, and gambling. He would return to La Tuna empty-handed and furious, leaving Consuelo to figure out how to feed the children. To stretch their meager resources, Joaquin sold oranges and homemade pastries on the dirt tracks of La Tuna and nearby villages, walking miles under the hot sun to bring home a few pesos. It was during these early years that Joaquin earned the nickname that would stick with him for the rest of his life, El Chapo, Shorty. He was short and stocky, built low to the ground with broad shoulders and a thick neck. What he lacked in height, however, he made up for in quiet, stubborn determination. He hated the poverty that trapped his family, and even more, he hated the helplessness that came with it. Education was virtually non-existent in the mountains. A traveling teacher visited La Tuna occasionally, holding classes under a tree or in a makeshift shelter, but Joaquin's formal schooling ended around the 3rd grade. He learned the basics of reading and writing, though he would struggle with complex text for the rest of his life. But what he lacked in formal education, he made up for with an innate, sharp intelligence for practical matters. He possessed an extraordinary memory for faces, names, routes, and numbers. He understood human nature, particularly the motives of fear, greed, and loyalty. By the time Chapo reached his early teens, the dynamic between him and his father reached a breaking point. Fed up with Emilio's violence and his squandering of the family's hard-earned money, Chapo stood his ground. He was no longer just a helpless child. He had grown strong from years of physical labor in the fields. After a series of fierce confrontations, Emilio kicked his teenage son out of the family home. Cast out on his own, Chapo did not leave the mountains. Instead, he went to live with his maternal grandfather and decided to enter the drug trade on his own terms. Using a small plot of remote land in the hills, the teenage Chapo began growing his own marijuana plants in poppy fields. Running his own small operation forced Chapo to learn every aspect of the business from the ground up. He learned how to select the best land that could not be easily spotted by government reconnaissance planes. He learned how to manage water resources in the dry mountains, how to dry and pack marijuana so it would not rot during transport, and how to negotiate prices with the buyers who acted as middlemen between the mountain growers and the distribution networks in the cities. Chapo quickly distinguished himself from the other young men in the Sierra. Where others were reckless, spending their money as fast as they made it, Chapo was calculating and frugal. He treated the trade not as a wild adventure, but as a strict, cold business. He paid his workers on time, a rare practice in a region where workers were often cheated, which earned him their early loyalty. He was reliable, and in the underworld, reliability was a rare commodity. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the demand for illegal drugs in the United States was surging. The golden triangle of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua was becoming the primary engine for North American heroin and marijuana production. Large-scale buyers were looking for ambitious, disciplined young men in the mountains who could guarantee steady shipments without causing trouble or attracting the attention of the authorities. Chapo realized that La Tuna was too small for his ambitions. The real money and power were not in the dirt fields of the Sierra Madre, but down in the valley cities, where the harvest of the mountains was consolidated, packaged, and shipped north across the border. He had mastered the dirt. Now he needed to master the roads. Around the age of 20, Chapo decided it was time to leave his home village behind. He packed his few belongings and left the mountain air of La Tuna for the bustling, dusty towns of the Sinaloa Plains, carrying with him the hard lessons of his childhood, a relentless work ethic, a deep comfort with violence, and an unquenchable thirst to rise above the poverty that had defined his youth. Leaving the rugged silence of the Sierra Madre behind, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman descended into the bustling lowlands of Sinaloa during the mid-1970s. The air here was warmer and heavy with exhaust fumes, dust, and coastal humidity, a stark contrast to the thin mountain breezes of La Tuna. He was in his early 20s, possessing no formal qualifications, no substantial wealth, and very little worldliness. However, he carried two invaluable assets forged in the mountains, an unyielding work ethic and a deep, practical knowledge of how to cultivate and process narcotics. To move up in the drug trade, Chapo needed connections. He found his entry point through his uncle, Pedro Avilés Perez. Known in criminal history as El León de la Sierra, the Lion of the Mountain, Avilés was a pioneer. He was among the first Mexican traffickers to realize the potential of using light aircraft to fly large shipments of marijuana and heroin directly over the U.S. border into Arizona and California. Working under Avilés exposed young Chapo to the mechanics of large-scale logistics. He was no longer just tending plants. He was watching how thousands of pounds of product were gathered, stored, and moved across state lines. When Pedro Avilés was killed in a violent shootout with federal police in 1978, the power structure of Mexican drug trafficking shifted dramatically. The epicenter of the business moved south from Culiacán to Guadalajara, the prosperous capital of Jalisco state. In Guadalajara, a new and far more organized organization was taking shape, the Guadalajara cartel. At the top of this new empire stood Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, widely known as El Padrino, the Godfather. Felix Gallardo was a former federal police officer turned criminal mastermind. Unlike the traditional mountain bosses who operated like rustic bandits, Felix Gallardo behaved like a corporate chief executive. He dressed in tailored suits, maintained polite relations with politicians, and recognized that the true fortune lay in forming an alliance with Colombian cartels to smuggle cocaine, rather than relying solely on Mexican-grown marijuana and heroin. Recognizing Chapo's reliability, senior lieutenants brought the short, sturdy young man from Sinaloa into the Guadalajara cartel's expanding apparatus. Initially, Chapo was assigned minor logistics tasks, but his relentless discipline quickly caught the attention of higher-ups, including Hector Luis, El Guerrero, Palma, and Felix Gallardo himself. Chapo was given a simple yet high-stakes role, managing the transport of narcotics from the rural growing zones in Sinaloa and Sonora down to the distribution hubs and border points. In this role, Chapo developed a reputation for extreme efficiency. He was obsessively punctual. When a shipment of cocaine arrived from Colombia or a truckload of marijuana was packed in the Sierra, Chapo set strict schedules for its delivery. His rules were brutally simple. If a driver arrived on time and the cargo was intact, they were paid immediately in cash, often with a generous bonus. But if a driver was late, careless, or suspected of stealing, the consequences were immediate and fatal. Chapo had no tolerance for excuses. Stories began to circulate among the cartel's lower ranks about Chapo's cold demeanor toward anyone who jeopardized a shipment. If a transport truck broke down or was seized because a driver took a wrong turn, Chapo would often execute the responsible party himself with a single shot to the head. This combination of prompt, reliable pay and absolute lethality earned him both the deep fear and total compliance of his subordinates. As the late 1970s transitioned into the 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel grew to unprecedented heights. Colombian traffickers, facing heavy crackdowns by U.S. authorities in the Caribbean, were looking for alternative routes to supply the soaring demand for cocaine in American cities. Felix Gallardo negotiated a deal with the Colombian cartels. The Mexicans would handle the transportation of cocaine across the U.S. Mexico border in exchange for a massive cut of the product itself, often up to 50% of the shipment. This arrangement flooded the Guadalajara cartel with billions of dollars, and Chapo was situated right in the middle of the supply chain. He closely studied Felix Gallardo's methods. From El Padrino, Chapo learned the critical importance of high-level corruption. He saw how police commanders, political figures, judges, and military generals could be bought with regular cash payments. The philosophy that would later be known as plata o plomo, silver or lead. Chapo observed how Felix Gallardo managed a vast network of regional bosses, keeping them organized while maintaining absolute central control. Yet, Despite his success, Chapo remained a distinct figure within Guadalajara. He did not adopt the flashy lifestyle favored by many young narcos who spent their money recklessly in nightclubs. He preferred to keep a low profile, continually focusing on logistics and operational security. He spent his time inspecting routes, establishing safe houses, buying off border guards, and refining transportation methods. During this period, Chapo began experimenting with innovative ways to move drugs past increasingly vigilant U.S. customs agents. While traditional methods involved hiding packages inside commercial cargo trucks or passenger vehicles, Chapo began looking underground. He realized that while the surface of the border was heavily patrolled, the earth beneath it was largely unmonitored. He began hiring engineers and laborers to dig the very first smuggling tunnels under the U.S. Mexico border, starting near Agua Prieta in Sonora and leading directly into Arizona. These early tunnels were basic, but they allowed tons of cocaine to pass undetected under the feet of American border patrols. By the mid-1980s, the Guadalajara cartel appeared invincible. However, its arrogance led to its undoing. In February 1985, members of the cartel abducted, tortured, and murdered Enrique "Kiki" Camarena, an agent for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration (D), who had infiltrated their operations and helped destroy a massive marijuana plantation known as Rancho El Bufalo. Camarena's murder provoked an unprecedented reaction from the United States government. Deeply angered, Washington launched a massive operation, pressuring the Mexican government to hunt down everyone responsible. The intense heat forced the leaders of the Guadalajara cartel into hiding. Key figures like Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo were captured within months. Felix Gallardo managed to evade arrest for a few more years by relying on his political protections, but his empire was fracturing. Knowing that his own capture was inevitable, El Padrino convened a secret meeting in Acapulco in 1989 with his top lieutenants. He decided to divide the cartel's territories among them to keep the business alive, creating regional fiefdoms. To his nephews, the Arellano Felix brothers, he assigned the lucrative Tijuana border corridor. To the Carrillo Fuentes family, he gave the Juarez border zone. And to his trusted logistics managers from Sinaloa, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Hector El Guero Palma, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, he assigned the Pacific Coast and the drug-producing regions of Sinaloa. Shortly after this meeting, in April 1989, Mexican authorities arrested Felix Gallardo at his home in Guadalajara. The era of a single, unified Mexican cartel was officially over. The apprentice had learned everything his master had to teach. Chapo was no longer just a driver or an enforcer. He was now a boss in his own right, standing at the threshold of a new, bloody era of drug kingpins. The arrest of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo in April 1989 shattered the fragile peace of the Mexican underworld. Without the quiet authority of El Padrino to mediate disputes, the vast network he had built fractured along geographic and personal fault lines. The division of territories agreed upon in Acapulco quickly collapsed under the weight of ambition, paranoia, and immense greed. In the northwest, the Arellano Felix brothers, Benjamin, Ramon, and Eduardo, entrenched themselves in the border city of Tijuana. They were stylish, arrogant, and vicious. They believed that because Tijuana was the most valuable border crossing into Southern California, they held total ownership over all drugs passing through Baja California. They demanded heavy taxes, known as piso, from any outside trafficker who wanted to move cargo across their stretch of the border. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, along with his closest allies Hector Luis, El Guero, Palma, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, refused to bow to the Arellano Felix family. They were sons of Sinaloa, men who had earned their reputation in the fields and dusty roads rather than urban nightclubs. Together, they formally established the Sinaloa cartel. While El Mayo focused on building deep political connections and El Guerrero managed enforcement, Chapo became the operational engine of the organization. His goal was simple: build a logistics pipeline so fast, discreet, and reliable that no other cartel could compete with them. To bypass the expensive taxes demanded by the Tijuana cartel, Chapo turned his full attention to alternative border crossings along the Sonora-Arizona line, particularly around the small town of Agua Prieta. It was here that Chapo perfected his signature engineering marvel, the border smuggling tunnel. Chapo hired skilled civil engineers and paid local construction crews double the standard wage to build underground passages that defied imagination. These were not primitive dirt trenches. They were equipped with reinforced concrete walls, electric lighting, four-stair ventilation systems, and miniature rail tracks to move heavy loads of cocaine and marijuana in minutes. A hydraulic lift hidden beneath a billiard table or a fake drain inside a private warehouse would lower cargo deep into the earth. Within a short time, thousands of kilos of Colombian cocaine were moving under the feet of U.S. Customs inspectors without a single shot being fired or a single bribe being paid to border guards. Chapo's tunnel system allowed the Sinaloa cartel to move cocaine at unprecedented speeds. Colombian suppliers in the Cali cartel quickly realized that Chapo was the most efficient operator in Mexico. While other Mexican bosses took weeks to move a shipment across the border, Chapo could receive a plane load of cocaine in Sonora and have it sitting in a Los Angeles warehouse within 24 hours. His speed earned him a new moniker among the Colombians, El Rapido, the Fast One. As Chapo's wealth and influence expanded, so did his friction with the Tijuana cartel. The Arellano Felix brothers viewed Chapo's growing power as a direct threat to their survival. The tension rapidly escalated into an all-out war that consumed western Mexico in the early 1990s. The conflict was personal and unforgiving. In late 1992, the Arellano Felix brothers sent hitmen to assassinate El Guerrero Palma and Chapo. While both bosses survived, the attack crossed a definitive line. Chapo retaliated with calculated ferocity. On November 8, 1992, Chapo dispatched a squad of 40 armed men dressed as federal police officers to the Christine nightclub, a high-end hotspot in Puerto Vallarta, where the Arellano Felix brothers were celebrating. The raid was a scene of utter chaos. Chapo's men stormed the club with automatic weapons, spraying hundreds of rounds of ammunition into the dance floor and VIP lounge. Glass shattered, music stopped, and patrons screamed as gunfire echoed off the walls. 6 people were killed in the mayhem. Benjamin and Ramon Arellano Felix managed to survive by squeezing through a narrow bathroom window and fleeing into the night, but the message was unmistakable. Chapo was coming for them, and he would stop at nothing to destroy their empire. The blood spill at the Christine nightclub signaled a terrifying shift in Mexican drug violence. What had once been a secret business conducted in backrooms and remote mountain passes was now spilling out into public plazas, luxury resorts, and urban centers. The war between Sinaloa and Tijuana was no longer just a struggle for drug routes. It had turned into a personal vendetta that would soon drag the entire nation into its wake. By the spring of 1993, the war between the Sinaloa cartel and the Tijuana cartel had reached a fever pitch. Both sides maintained heavily armed hit squads patrolling the streets of Guadalajara, Tijuana, and Culiacan, looking for any opportunity to strike a decisive blow against their rivals. On the afternoon of May 24, 1993, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was traveling through Guadalajara in a green Buick sedan, heading toward the Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla International Airport. He planned to fly to Puerto Vallarta to lie low after weeks of intense skirmishes. Chapo was accompanied by several bodyguards in nearby vehicles, keeping a sharp lookout for suspicious activity. Unbeknownst to Chapo, a hit squad led by Ramon Arellano Felix had also arrived at the airport. Ramon and his gunmen had received intelligence that Chapo would be at the terminal that afternoon, and they were determined not to let him escape alive this time. They prowled the airport parking lot in several trucks, weapons loaded and ready. At approximately 3:45 p.m., a white Mercury Grand Marquis pulled up near the main entrance of the airport terminal. Inside the car was Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, the Cardinal Archbishop of Guadalajara and one of the most prominent Catholic leaders in Mexico. The Cardinal had driven to the airport to welcome a Vatican diplomat who was arriving that afternoon. He was wearing his traditional clerical collar and a large pectoral cross hanging over his chest. As the Cardinal's car came to a stop, the Tijuana cartel hitmen misidentified the vehicle, believing it was part of Chapo's convoy. Within seconds, gunmen surrounded the Grand Marquis, pulled out automatic weapons, and opened fire at point-blank range. 14 bullets hit Cardinal Posadas Ocampo, killing him instantly alongside his driver. At the exact same time, Chapo's bodyguards realized what was happening and opened fire on the Tijuana hitmen. A chaotic, wild shootout erupted in the middle of the crowded airport parking lot. Travelers threw themselves onto the concrete floor, diving behind luggage carts and parked cars as hundreds of bullets filled the air. In the confusion and panic of the firefight, Chapo leapt out of his Buick, sprinted across the parking lot while dodging bullets, and made his way into the terminal building. Using the surging crowd of panicked travelers as cover, he slipped out an exit on the opposite side of the airport and escaped into the city. 6 other innocent people were killed in the crossfire, but Chapo himself walked away without a single scratch. The murder of Cardinal Posadas Ocampo sent shockwaves across Mexico and the entire Catholic world. The Mexican public was deeply outraged by the brazen execution of a high-ranking church leader in broad daylight. The Mexican government, led by President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, faced immense domestic and international pressure to react swiftly and decisively. The unwritten agreement where authorities tolerated drug violence as long as it remained hidden was permanently broken. Federal authorities launched one of the largest manhunts in Mexican history. Photos of the key players involved in the shootout, including Ramon Arellano Felix and Joaquin Guzman Loera, were plastered across newspapers, television broadcasts, and wanted posters nationwide. Massive monetary rewards were offered for information leading to their arrest. Chapo knew that remaining in Mexico was impossible. Federal police and military units were raiding every known safe house, ranch, and business associated with the Sinaloa cartel. Armed with falsified passports and millions of dollars in cash, Chapo fled south, crossing the border into Guatemala in early June 1993. He hoped to hide out in Central America until the political storm in Mexico blew over. However, Chapo underestimated the reach of international law enforcement and the willingness of foreign governments to cooperate. Mexican intelligence agencies, working closely with Guatemalan military officials, tracked Chapo's movements through tapped phone lines and informant tips. On June 9, 1993, near the border crossing of La Mesilla between Mexico and Guatemala, Guatemalan army officers intercepted Chapo's vehicle. Surrounded by heavily armed troops and realizing he had no way out, the 36-year-old drug lord surrendered without firing a shot. Guatemalan authorities quickly handed Chapo over to Mexican federal agents. 2 days later, on June 11, Chapo was presented to the press at a high-security facility in Mexico City. Clad in a heavy tan parka, yellow winter cap, and jeans, Chapo stood under a pouring rain, handcuffed and surrounded by masked guards. He smirked slightly for the flashing cameras, downplaying his role in the drug trade and claiming to be nothing more than a humble farmer. From Mexico City, Chapo was transferred under heavy guard to Altiplano, then known as La Palma, Mexico's premier maximum security prison. The man who had built the most sophisticated underground smuggling network in the world was now trapped inside 4 walls of solid concrete. When Joaquin El Chapo Guzman arrived at the maximum security prison, he was expected to spend the rest of his life stripped of power, isolated and forgotten. However, maximum security prisons in Mexico during the 1990s were governed by an invisible currency that Chapo possessed in endless supply: cash. In November 1995, after spending over 2 years at La Palma, Chapo was transferred to the Puente Grande maximum security prison in the state of Jalisco. The prison's name translated to Big Bridge, but among the inmates and staff, it soon acquired a far more fitting nickname: Puente de Oro, the Golden Bridge. Chapo understood that a prison was not built merely of steel and concrete. It was run by human beings who had low salaries, personal debts, and families to support. Upon his arrival at Puente Grande, Chapo set out to systematically corrupt the entire institution from top to bottom. He did not use overt threats or violence unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he relied on overwhelming generosity and charm, backed by a constant stream of cartel money. Within months of his arrival, Chapo was no longer living as an inmate. He was running Puente Grande like his personal private estate. Guard supervisors, medical staff, administrative officers, and even prison wardens were placed on his payroll, receiving regular monthly stipends that dwarfed their official government salaries. Those who cooperated were showered with cash, expensive gifts, and promotions. Those who refused were quietly transferred or reminded that their families outside the walls were completely unprotected. Chapo's cell was transformed into a comfortable suite. He was allowed to keep personal electronics, wear comfortable clothing instead of standard inmate uniforms, and order custom meals prepared to his liking. While other inmates were subjected to strict meal schedules and inedible food, Chapo had fresh steaks, seafood, and fine wine delivered directly to his quarters. The prison rules regarding visitation were completely erased for Chapo. While ordinary prisoners were limited to short, monitored visits behind thick glass, Chapo hosted elaborate, multi-day parties inside the prison walls. Family members, business associates, musicians, and female companions walked in and out of the facility through private entrances, without undergoing security checks or signing visitor logs. It was during his time at Puente Grande that Chapo met Zulema Hernandez, a fellow inmate serving a sentence for robbery. Chapo used his influence over the prison staff to arrange frequent, unsupervised visits with Zulema, providing her with privileges, money, and protection within the women's section of the complex. Despite being incarcerated, Chapo never lost control of the Sinaloa cartel. Puente Grande served as a secure, heavily guarded headquarters for his criminal enterprise. Using smuggled cell phones, encrypted radios, and notes carried out by his lawyers, Chapo continued to direct drug shipments, settle territorial disputes, and issue orders to his lieutenants across Mexico. His primary partner on the outside, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, kept the business operating smoothly, making sure that Chapo's share of the profits was collected and distributed as directed. Chapo also formed a crucial alliance inside the prison walls with Arturo Beltran Leyva, a powerful Sinaloan boss who managed the cartel's distribution networks on the outside. The Beltran Leyva family funneled millions of dollars into Puente Grande to maintain Chapo's luxurious lifestyle and ensure that every guard remained loyal to him. For nearly 6 years, Chapo enjoyed an unprecedented degree of freedom inside a maximum security facility. He spent his days exercising, conducting business meetings, watching television, and socializing with prison staff who treated him with deferential respect, calling him Don Joaquin. However, this comfortable reality began to shift rapidly as the year 2000 came to a close. A political transformation was sweeping Mexico. Vicente Fox, the candidate from the opposition National Action Party, PAN, won the presidential election, ending 70 years of continuous rule by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI. Fox promised a total crackdown on public corruption and cartels. At the same time, federal courts in the United States were pressing hard for Chapo's extradition to face drug trafficking charges in American courts. Chapo knew that, while he could control a Mexican prison with money, an American supermax facility would mean complete isolation and a permanent end to his empire. By early January 2001, rumors reached Chapo that the Mexican Supreme Court was preparing a ruling that would make the extradition of Mexican citizens to the United States far easier. The walls of Puente Grande, which had kept him safe and comfortable for years, suddenly felt like a trap that was closing in on him. Chapo decided it was time to leave. By mid-January 2001, the tension inside Puente Grande had reached a boiling point. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman knew his time was running out. The United States Supreme Court and Mexican authorities were moving closer toward a seamless extradition process. Once transferred to American custody, no amount of cash, influence, or corrupted guards could buy his freedom. If he was going to break out of Mexico's premier maximum security prison, he had to act immediately. Chapo did not plan a violent assault with armed commandos bursting through the gates. Instead, he relied on the deep, rotten network of corruption he had built inside the prison over 6 years. Almost every layer of the prison hierarchy, from low-level maintenance workers to senior administrative officers, was on his payroll. On the evening of Friday, January 19, 2001, the plan was put into motion. The key figure on the ground was Francisco Javier Camberos Rivera, a prison maintenance worker universally known by his nickname, El Cheeto. El Cheeto had complete access to the internal service corridors and held the trust of the guard force. According to the official investigation, El Cheeto arrived at Chapo's cell carrying a large, canvas laundry cart piled high with dirty linens and uniforms. Chapo, who was short and flexible, climbed into the bottom of the cart, folding his body underneath layers of soiled clothing. El Cheeto then wheeled the heavy cart out of the cell block. The journey through the internal structure of Puente Grande required passing through multiple security checkpoints, heavy electronic doors, and hallways monitored by closed-circuit cameras. However, the security system was effectively dead. Electronic locks were left disengaged, security cameras were conveniently turned away or shut off, and guards on duty actively looked the other way as El Cheeto pushed the cart along. El Cheeto wheeled the cart down service elevators and out toward the prison's maintenance garage and loading bay. There, Chapo climbed out of the laundry cart and slipped into the trunk of a waiting Chevrolet Monte Carlo driven by El Cheeto. The car pulled up to the main outer gate of the prison complex. The guard at the gate, fully aware of who was inside, raised the barrier without inspecting the vehicle. The car drove out into the cool Jalisco night, disappearing down the highway toward Guadalajara. It took hours for the prison administration to officially notice that Mexico's most famous inmate was missing. By the time the alarm finally sounded and federal forces surrounded the perimeter, Chapo was miles away, stepping out of the trunk and into a waiting convoy organized by his Sinaloa cartel lieutenants. While the laundry cart story became an instant legend, many investigators and journalists later argued that the official narrative was partly a cover to hide the true scale of institutional failure. Whether he physically hid in a laundry cart or simply walked out the front door dressed in a police uniform with the warden's full approval, the outcome was identical. The Mexican state had been utterly humiliated. Dozens of prison workers, guards, and the warden himself were subsequently arrested, but the damage was already done. President Vicente Fox, who had promised to clean up corruption, faced a massive political crisis. The government launched a sweeping, nationwide manhunt, deploying thousands of federal agents and military units to track down the fugitive. But Chapo was no longer the mid-level boss who had been caught in Guatemala 8 years earlier. Immediately after his escape, Chapo retreated to the place where he was truly invincible: the rugged, roadless mountains of the Sierra Madre, the Golden Triangle spanning Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua. The mountain communities of his youth welcomed him back not as an escaped criminal, but as a returning king. He established a network of heavily armed security rings, secret hideouts, and high-tech communication systems that allowed him to monitor government movements in real time. The escape from Puente Grande marked the official beginning of Chapo's golden era. Over the next 13 years, he would transform the Sinaloa cartel from a powerful regional syndicate into the most dominant, aggressive, and wealthy narcotics enterprise on Earth. The legend of El Chapo was born, and the hunt for the world's most wanted kingpin had officially begun. Following his vanishing act from Puente Grande in 2001, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman did not simply hide in the mountains. He revolutionized global narcotics distribution. While the Mexican federal government and U.S. law enforcement agencies combed the country looking for a desperate fugitive, Chapo was operating like the chief executive officer of a multinational corporation. Under his leadership, the Sinaloa cartel expanded into a massive, sophisticated criminal empire with a supply chain that spanned 5 continents. Chapo understood that in the world of drug trafficking, production was only a small part of the equation. The real power and the real profit lay in logistics. Moving tons of illegal commodities across heavily fortified international borders required constant innovation, absolute discipline, and an architectural mastery of the physical world. The cornerstone of Chapo's logistical revolution was his relentless refinement of cross-border smuggling tunnels. What had started in the late 1980s as simple underground passageways near Agua Prieta grew into extraordinary works of underground engineering. Beneath the bustling border twin cities of Nogales, Agua Prieta, and Tijuana, San Diego, Chapo's engineers dug dozens of secret subterranean highways through hard clay and solid rock. These were not crude burrows. Chapo hired professional mining engineers, hydrogeologists, and electricians to construct state-of-the-art tunnels. Digging often began inside industrial warehouses or private homes on the Mexican side, where heavy machinery could operate under the cover of daily commercial noise. The tunnels extended 40 to 60 feet beneath the surface, deep enough to bypass border fence foundations and ground-penetrating radar used by U.S. Border Patrol. Inside, the tunnels featured reinforced concrete or timber supports, electric rail tracks with battery-powered carts to transport thousands of pounds of narcotics in minutes, hydraulic lift systems, forced air ventilation, and custom drainage systems to prevent flooding during rainy seasons. Entry points were hidden beneath motorized concrete slabs, secret trapdoors under heavy furniture, or inside working hydraulic lifts disguised as ordinary garage floors. Through these underground arteries, tens of billions of dollars worth of cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and marijuana flowed silently into the United States without triggering a single alarm. When law enforcement adapted to tunnel detection, Chapo adapted faster, expanding his transportation methods into the sky and across the seas. He assembled a vast fleet of private aircraft, turboprops, light twin-engine planes, and cargo airliners, operating out of hidden dirt airstrips scattered across the Sierra Madre Mountains. These planes flew low over the terrain to evade radar detection, dropping loads onto remote ranches in northern Mexico or transferring cargo directly to secondary transport teams. On the open ocean, Chapo pioneered maritime smuggling on a scale never seen before. The Sinaloa cartel deployed speedboats, commercial fishing trawlers, container ships, and eventually semi-submersible vessels, popularly known as narco submarines. Built in hidden shipyards in the jungles of Central and South America, these low-profile vessels rode barely below the water's surface, painted in dark blues and grays to blend seamlessly into the sea. Powered by heavy diesel engines, they could carry several tons of cocaine thousands of miles up the Pacific coast from Colombia and Ecuador directly to offloading points in Mexico or Central America, completely invisible to naval radar. Chapo also modernized the cartel's global chemical supply chain. Recognizing the shifting market trends in the mid-2000s, he spearheaded a major pivot towards synthetic drugs, particularly high-purity methamphetamine. To supply the necessary precursor chemicals, Chapo established direct trading routes with chemical suppliers in China and India. Raw chemicals were shipped in massive ocean freight containers to Mexican Pacific ports like Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas. From there, the cargo was moved to industrial-scale superlabs hidden in the remote mountains of Sinaloa and Michoacán, where chemists produced tons of pure crystal meth for export to the U.S., Europe, and Australia. To manage this complex global web, Chapo instituted a strict corporate structure. He divided responsibilities among key lieutenants, establishing specialized departments for transport, enforcement, financial laundering, and political bribery. Millions of dollars were funneled through legitimate front companies, construction firms, currency exchanges, real estate ventures, and agriculture businesses, to wash the drug money clean before it re-entered the global banking system. Chapo's obsession with detail, efficiency, and technological adaptability turned the Sinaloa cartel into the undisputed superpower of global narcotics trafficking. By the late 2000s, his network was supplying a significant portion of all illicit drugs consumed in the United States, earning him a place on the Forbes list of the world's billionaire leaders. But this immense wealth and global dominance came at a terrifying cost. As Chapo pushed his empire into new cities and border crossings, he ran directly into rival cartels determined to defend their own territory, sparking a wave of bloody violence that would consume all of Mexico. The massive expansion of Chapo's global network inevitably triggered a violent reaction across Mexico. In the world of organized crime, territory was everything. For the Sinaloa cartel to maintain its dominance and keep its massive distribution pipelines full, it needed total control over key border cities, especially Ciudad Juárez and Nuevo Laredo. However, these corridors were fiercely guarded by rival syndicates who viewed Chapo's ambition as an existential threat. What followed was a brutal, multi-front war that turned entire Mexican cities into active combat zones and redefined the horrors of the drug trade. The conflict flared dramatically in the mid-2000s when Chapo made a direct play for Nuevo Laredo, the busiest inland trade port on the U.S. Mexico border. At the time, Nuevo Laredo was controlled by the Gulf Cartel, supported by their terrifying enforcement wing, Los Zetas. Los Zetas were unlike any rival Chapo had previously encountered. They were not mountain growers or traditional street thugs. They were elite former officers from the Mexican Army's Special Forces who had deserted to work as private mercenaries for Gulf Cartel leader Ocio Cardenas Gillane. Highly trained in urban warfare, counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence gathering, and psychological operations, Los Zetas introduced military-grade brutality to the cartel wars. Determined to wrench control of Nuevo Laredo from Los Zetas, Chapo formed his own elite paramilitary squad known as Los Negros, led by his ruthless Lieutenant Edgar Valdez Villarreal, known as La Barbie due to his fair skin and blonde hair. The battle for Nuevo Laredo was unforgiving. Street corners, nightclub districts, and residential neighborhoods became battlefields for gunfights involving assault rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and armored vehicles. Los Zetas used terror as a core strategy, hanging mutilated bodies from public bridges, leaving severed heads in plaza fountains, and recording brutal executions to intimidate local police, government officials, and the public. Chapo's forces responded in kind, matching their rivals' savagery step for step. While the battle with Los Zetas raged along the eastern border, an even deadlier betrayal was brewing inside Chapo's inner circle. For decades, the Beltran Leyva brothers, Arturo, Hector, Alfredo, and Carlos, had been Chapo's closest cousins, childhood friends, and indispensable allies. They had managed enforcement, money laundering, and high-level political bribery for the Sinaloa cartel, and Arturo Beltran Leyva had been instrumental in funding Chapo's lavish lifestyle while he was imprisoned at Puente Grande. However, in January 2008, Mexican federal forces raided a safe house in Culiacan and arrested Alfredo Beltran Leyva, known as El Machomo. Arturo Beltran Leyva became consumed by paranoia, convincing himself that Chapo had betrayed his brother to the military in a secret trade to protect his own sons or secure immunity for Sinaloa operations. The accusation tore the Sinaloa cartel apart. Arturo severed ties with Chapo and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, declaring a war of vengeance against his former brothers-in-arms. To crush Chapo, the Beltran Leyva organization formed a deadly alliance with their former enemies, Los Zetas and the Juarez cartel. The war between Chapo and the Beltran Leyva brothers turned Sinaloa into a slaughterhouse. Assassins stalked the streets of Culiacan day and night. Police officers, politicians, journalists, and civilians were caught in the relentless crossfire. The violence struck Chapo at his most vulnerable point on May 8, 2008. In a shopping center parking lot in Culiacan, a heavily armed hit squad dispatched by the Beltran Leyva cartel ambushed Chapo's 22-year-old son, Edgar Guzman Lopez. Over 500 military-grade shell casings were recovered from the scene. Edgar was blown apart in a hail of gunfire before his bodyguards could react. The loss of his young son devastated Chapo and unleashed a wave of fury across Sinaloa. In the days following Edgar's murder, Chapo bought every single red rose available in Culiacan for his son's funeral, leaving the city's flower shops completely empty for Mother's Day, an event later immortalized in local popular ballads known as corrido songs. Chapo retaliated with cold, systematic violence, deploying the full financial and military force of the Sinaloa cartel to track down and eliminate every member of the Beltran Leyva faction. In December 2009, Mexican Marines cornered Arturo Beltran Leyva in a luxury apartment complex in Cuernavaca. After a furious hours-long firefight, Arturo was shot dead, effectively crippling his organization. Simultaneously, Chapo waged a devastating campaign in Ciudad Juarez against the local Juarez cartel and its armed wing, La Línea. Juarez quickly became the murder capital of the world, recording thousands of homicides a year as Chapo's squads fought block by block to capture the border crossing. By 2012, after years of continuous bloodshed that claimed tens of thousands of lives across Mexico, Chapo emerged victorious. He had decimated the Beltran Leyva cartel, pushed the Juarez cartel into irrelevance, and successfully defended his territory against Los Zetas. The cost was astronomical, but Joaquin El Chapo Guzman stood at the absolute pinnacle of power, the undisputed kingpin of the global drug trade. While his gunmen fought and died on the streets of Ciudad Juarez and Nuevo Laredo, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman existed in a realm far above the daily violence. To the government forces hunting him across Mexico, he was a ruthless criminal and the leader of a dangerous global cartel. But inside the rugged territory of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, a vast mountain area known as the Golden Triangle, he was something entirely different. There, Chapo was a living legend, a protective benefactor, and a modern-day Robin Hood. The myth of El Chapo did not happen by accident. It was built carefully over years of hiding in plain sight. After escaping from the Puente Grande maximum security prison in a laundry cart in 2001, Chapo made the Golden Triangle his fortress. The mountains of the Sierra Madre Occidental offered natural defenses that no army could easily break. Dense pine forests, deep canyons, and hidden valleys created an impassable maze. Thick fog often rolled over the mountain peaks, grounding government helicopters and blinding military surveillance. However, Chapo knew that high mountains and thick trees were not enough to keep him safe. The real key to his survival was the absolute loyalty of the local population. In the small mountain villages of Badiraguato, Cainlas, and Temazula, state presence was virtually non-existent. The Mexican federal government rarely built roads, provided doctors, or funded schools in these isolated communities. Chapo stepped into that empty space, using his immense drug wealth to act as the primary ruler and provider for the region for the rural villagers. Chapo was not a distant criminal boss. He was the man who kept their communities alive. When a village needed a new church, Chapo paid for the stone and the workers. When a school fell into disrepair, he sent money to rebuild it. If a child fell dangerously ill, his men arranged for private doctors or helicopter transports to urban hospitals. He paved dirt roads, installed electric generators in off-grid mountain hamlets, and ensured that local farmers received fair pay for cultivating crops. In return, the villagers gave him complete devotion. They formed an invisible human radar system that covered thousands of square miles. The moment Mexican army trucks or federal police vehicles left their barracks in Culiacan or Durango, word traveled up the mountains. Ranchers, taxi drivers, street vendors, and teenagers with handheld radios passed warnings along the line. By the time military convoys reached the high mountain passes, Chapo had already been warned. He would simply step into a concealed underground bunker, mount an all-terrain vehicle, or board a small private plane to vanish into the deep woods. This protective aura fueled a massive cultural movement in Mexico. Chapo became the central figure of narco corridos, popular accordion-driven ballads that romanticized the drug trade. Local bands sang stories about his humble origins in Tuna, his grand escape from prison, his sharp intelligence, and his ability to mock federal authorities. These songs played on regional radio stations, at family gatherings, and in packed nightclubs across northern Mexico and the southwestern United States. In the public imagination, Chapo was transformed into a folk hero, a small-town man who had started with nothing, defeated his enemies, outsmarted the powerful government, and never forgot where he came from. This Robin Hood image matched a long tradition in Sinaloa, where locals had worshipped Jesus Malverde for over a century. Known as the generous bandit, or the patron saint of drug traffickers, Malverde was a legendary 19th-century figure who allegedly stole from rich landowners to feed the starving poor. Chapo presented himself as the natural successor to Malverde. He embraced the idea that he was a protector of the people, fighting against corrupt politicians and rival gangs who brought chaos and violence to innocent communities. Stories about Chapo's legendary audacity spread across the country, making him seem almost larger than life. One widely shared urban legend described how he enjoyed dining in popular restaurants in cities like Culiacan, Mazatlán, or Guadalajara. According to local accounts, Chapo's armed bodyguards would quietly enter an upscale steakhouse or seafood restaurant and politely secure the doors. They would confiscate everyone's cell phones, promising that no one would be harmed and asking the guests to stay calm. Chapo would then walk in, sit down, and enjoy his meal in peace. Once he finished, his men would return every cell phone, pay for everyone's meals in the entire restaurant, leave generous cash tips for the waiters, and disappear into the night before police could react. While these stories added to his romantic myth, Chapo's private life was defined by the same grand excess as his criminal empire. He lived like a medieval king, keeping multiple lavish homes across Mexico. He owned sprawling ranches in Sinaloa, beachside estates in Acapulco, safe houses with secret escape tunnels, and private zoos stocked with exotic animals, including tigers, lions, and panthers. He traveled with a personal army of bodyguards, rode purebred horses, and collected customized firearms decorated with gold, diamonds, and his personal initials Chapo was also famous for his relationships with women, which often crossed into the public eye and created dramatic news stories. Over the decades, he married multiple times and fathered numerous children. But no relationship captured public attention quite like his romance with Emma Coronel Espuro in late 2006. The 49-year-old Chapo attended a local festival in the remote town of Cañas, Durango. There, he saw 17-year-old Emma Coronel, a dual American-Mexican citizen who was competing in the local Miss Coffee and Guava beauty pageant. Emma was already tied to the cartel world. Her father, Iniacutes Coronel Barras, and her uncle, Ignacio Nacho Coronel, were key figures in the Sinaloa cartel. Chapo was instantly smitten. To ensure her victory in the pageant, Chapo flew hundreds of heavily armed men into Cañas, hosting a lavish party that dominated the town. Soon after, Emma Coronel was crowned beauty queen. On her 18th birthday in July 2007, Chapo married Emma in a private, high-security wedding in the Durango Mountains, creating a union that combined cartel bloodlines and public glamour. Years later, Emma would give birth to twin girls in a Southern California hospital, securing U.S. citizenship for Chapo's youngest children while staying close to her fugitive husband. Yet beneath the romantic ballads, the extravagant wedding, and the generous gifts to mountain villages lay a stark reality. Chapo was not a selfless benefactor. He was a cold, calculating businessman who used philanthropy as an operational strategy. The money he spent on churches, roads, and local schools was a tiny fraction of the billions of dollars his cartel generated by distributing cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana worldwide. The loyalty he bought from local villagers served a clear purpose. It protected a global narcotics empire that left thousands dead in its wake. Furthermore, Chapo's control over the Golden Triangle relied on strict enforcement. The same man who paid for a sick child's medical care had no hesitation ordering the execution of anyone suspected of speaking to federal agents or aiding rival cartels. Fear and love were two sides of the same coin in Chapo's territory, ensuring that his authority remained absolute for more than a decade. This combination of public support, intense violence, widespread political corruption, and deep geographic isolation kept Chapo completely out of reach. While the Mexican military launched massive operations into the Sierra Madre and the U.S., State Department offered a $5 million reward for his capture. Chapo moved through the mountains like a ghost. He met with business associates, managed his vast logistics networks, spent time with his family, and continued to expand his empire across 6 continents. He had become a rare figure, a fugitive who was both a globally wanted criminal and a beloved regional monarch. In the eyes of many Sinaloans, Chapo was untouchable. But as the war for narco supremacy settled and Chapo reached the peak of his fame, the massive law enforcement apparatus of 2 nations was quietly surrounding him. The myth of the invincible mountain king was about to face its ultimate test. For 13 long years, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman lived as an untouchable ghost. Since his 2001 escape from the Puente Grande maximum security prison in a laundry cart, he had successfully evaded thousands of Mexican federal soldiers, state police, and American intelligence agencies. He had built the Sinaloa cartel into the most powerful drug trafficking empire on earth, operated across 50 nations, and accumulated a fortune that placed him on Forbes magazine's list of the world's richest billionaires. Yet, the very thing that made Chapo a criminal genius, his total reliance on a tight, loyal inner circle, proved to be his ultimate undoing. By late 2013, the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Marshals Service had shifted their strategy. They realized that hunting Chapo directly in his high mountain fortresses was almost impossible. The geography was too harsh, and local villagers were too loyal. Instead, American agents and an elite unit of the Mexican Navy, the Marina, decided to cut off the roots of his tree. They targeted his communications network and his top lieutenants. The turning point came through modern technology. American intelligence agencies intercepted encrypted phone transmissions from BlackBerries used by Sinaloa cartel operatives. Using advanced wiretaps, real-time cell tower tracking, and tips from informants, federal agents began knocking down Chapo's inner wall piece by piece. In early February 2014, a domino effect began across the state of Sinaloa. Mexican Marines launched a series of precise raids in the state capital of Culiacan. One by one, Chapo's top lieutenants, hitmen, and trusted couriers were arrested. Among those captured was Mario Hidalgo Arguello, known as El Narfi, a key logistics manager, and Carlos Manuel Ramirez, known as Condor, a former Special Forces soldier who served as Chapo's personal secretary and bodyguard. When security forces interrogated these captured men, they discovered a critical weakness. Chapo had gotten comfortable. He had begun leaving his isolated mountain hideouts in the Golden Triangle to spend more time in urban centers. He wanted to enjoy the comforts of city life, visit his young twin daughters, and meet with his wife, Emma Coronel. That was a fatal error, former DEA officials later remarked. The Kingpin had stepped out of his natural element. On February 17, 2014, around 4 o'clock a.m., Mexican Marines and DEA agents struck a modest single-story house in Culiacan belonging to Chapo's ex-wife, Griselda Lopez Perez. The heavily armed Marines rushed the front door with a heavy steel battering ram. However, Chapo had spent years preparing his city safe houses for this exact scenario. The front door was made of reinforced steel, designed to withstand intense force. It took the Marines crucial minutes to break through the fortified door. That short delay gave Chapo all the time he needed inside the master bedroom. Chapo stepped into the bathroom and lifted a secret hydraulic lift hidden beneath the bathtub. The bathtub rose into the air, revealing a dark, steel-framed opening underneath. Chapo, his mistress, and his bodyguard dropped down a corrugated steel ladder into a high-tech subterranean escape route. This was not just a simple hole in the ground. It was a brilliant engineering feat. Chapo had built an interconnected underground system linking 7 different safe houses across Culiacan directly into the city's storm drain network. The tunnels were well lit, fully ventilated, and lined with wood paneling. As the Marines finally broke into the house, Chapo was already walking through the dark sewage canals under the city streets, completely escaping the military perimeter. For 3 days, federal forces searched Culiacan's underground drainage pipes. They recovered automatic rifles, night vision goggles, drugs, and satellite phones left behind in the dark tunnels, but the drug lord had vanished again. Chapo believed he was safe. He traveled south along the Pacific coast to Mazatlán, a popular tourist resort city known for its sandy beaches and high-rise oceanfront hotels. He assumed that federal forces would still be tearing Culiacan apart looking for him, and that a crowded beach town would serve as the perfect hiding spot. He checked into Hotel Miramar, a 10-story, pearl-colored condominium building located along Mazatlán's main coastal boulevard. Chapo rented apartment 401 on the 4th floor. It was surprisingly modest for a man worth $1 billion. The apartment had inexpensive furniture, white balconies facing the Pacific Ocean, and a small pool in the front courtyard. Inside, there were no gold guns or luxury items, just a few groceries, cartons of eggs, and children's toys scattered across the floor. He was staying there quietly with Emma Coronel, their twin daughters, a nanny, a personal chef, and his loyal bodyguard, Condor. Chapo made one final, catastrophic mistake. He kept using his cell phone. U.S. intelligence agencies intercepted a signal from a BlackBerry belonging to his bodyguard inside the Miramar complex. American wiretap specialists pinged the exact location and immediately alerted the Mexican Navy Command Center. On the night of February 21, 2014, a team of elite Mexican Marines, accompanied by a small group of U.S. Marshals and DEA agents, quietly assembled in Mazatlán. They set up a command post nearby and monitored the Miramar building from the shadows. They did not block the streets with heavy military trucks or blow sirens, as that would alert Chapo's lookouts. They wanted absolute stealth. At 6:40 a.m. on Saturday, February 22, just minutes after the sun began to rise over the Pacific Ocean, the strike team moved. A squad of Marines crept up the stairs to the 4th floor. Outside apartment 401, they encountered Chapo's heavily armed bodyguard, Condor, standing guard. Condor started to reach for his weapon, but before he could react, half a dozen Marine assault rifles were pointed directly at his chest. Realizing he was hopelessly outnumbered, Condor lowered his hands and surrendered without making a sound. The Marines breached the front door of apartment 401. Inside, they swept through the rooms. Emma Coronel screamed in fear, trying to protect her 2 young daughters as heavily armed men in camouflage filled the hallway. Hearing the commotion, Chapo rushed into the master bathroom. For a brief moment, the world's most wanted drug lord considered fighting. But he was wearing only shorts. He was completely unarmed, and there were no secret escape tunnels beneath this bathtub. Within seconds, Marines kicked open the bathroom door and aimed their weapons at him. "Don't shoot." Chapo yielded the 13-year international manhunt that had cost thousands of lives and millions of dollars, ended in absolute, silent surrender. Not a single shot was fired during the entire raid. The Marines shoved the short, dark-haired Kingpin down against the floor and handcuffed his wrists tightly behind his back. Outside the Hotel Murhammer, tourist buses and local morning commuters moved along the beach avenue, completely unaware that the emperor of global narcotics had just been captured. Inside news of the arrest swept across the globe within hours. Media outlets worldwide broke into regular programming to announce that Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was back in custody. International news anchors compared his capture to the fall of Colombia's Pablo Escobar or the killing of Osama bin Laden. In Washington, D.C., U.S., Attorney General Eric Holder called the operation a landmark achievement and a major victory for both the United States and Mexico. Later that day, Mexican authorities put Chapo on public display in Mexico City. A military helicopter landed at the federal hangar near the airport. Surrounded by masked Mexican Marines wearing full tactical gear, Chapo was paraded in front of dozens of news cameras. He wore a simple black button-down shirt and dark pants. He looked tired, older, and noticeably smaller than his legendary myth suggested. A Marine firmly held the back of Chapo's neck, pushing his head down toward the pavement as they marched him across the tarmac into a waiting Navy helicopter for the Mexican government, led by President Enrique Peña Nieto. Chapo's capture was a massive political triumph. Peña Nieto had promised to restore order and end the horrific violence that had plagued Mexico for years. Capturing the boss of bosses was proof that his security strategy was working. United States federal prosecutors immediately requested Chapo's extradition to face drug trafficking, murder, and racketeering charges in American courts. However, the Mexican government proudly refused. Mexican officials declared that Chapo must first serve his time in Mexico to face justice for his crimes on Mexican soil. They promised the world that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, and that he would be held in the highest security prison in the nation. Chapo was flown directly to Altiplano, a maximum security prison located in Santa Juana, near Mexico City. Altiplano was considered the most secure fortress in the country. It featured thick concrete walls, anti-bomb barriers, satellite jamming systems, dozens of armed guard towers, and hundreds of surveillance cameras monitoring every movement as the heavy steel doors of Cell 20 locked behind him. The world believed that the era of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was finally over. The criminal empire he had built seemed destined to crumble, and his long run as a fugitive had reached its ultimate end. However, behind the cold concrete walls of Altiplano, Chapo was far from finished. Even as the Mexican government celebrated its victory, Chapo was already looking at the small concrete floor inside his prison shower cell, and planning an escape that would shock the world even more than his first. The Altiplano Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, located near Almoloya de Juarez, was meant to be an inescapable fortress. Built with reinforced concrete walls over 3 feet thick, guard towers positioned every few hundred meters, dynamic electronic security, and full satellite monitoring, Mexican authorities proudly boasted that no inmate could ever breach its perimeter. Inside Special Treatment Area #2, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was placed in Cell 20. He was assigned a personal guard unit, subjected to constant search operations, and monitored 24 hours a day by a dedicated closed-circuit camera focused directly on his room. Yet, to a man who had built his vast narcotics empire on the mastery of underground architecture, concrete and surveillance were merely engineering problems waiting to be solved. Chapo understood that he could not rely on bribery alone to walk out the front gate as he had at Puente Grande in 2001. The international spotlight on his February 2014 arrest in Mazatlán was too intense, and Mexican authorities were determined to show the United States that they could keep him secured. If he wanted to escape Altiplano, he had to go beneath it. The master plan began just weeks after Chapo walked into cell 20. Through his legal team, who were granted regular access under Mexican prison regulations, Chapo passed precise messages and operational capital back to his inner circle. The logistical operation was headed by his sons, known collectively as Los Chapitos, along with his wife, Emma Coronel, and his most trusted master tunnel engineer, a man known simply as El Tío. In mid-2014, associates of the Sinaloa cartel purchased a half-acre plot of agricultural land located about 1 mile south of the Altiplano prison wall in a quiet rural community called Santa Juana. To avoid raising suspicion among local farmers, the cartel quickly constructed a modest, unfinished cinder block house with a corrugated tin roof. Outside, it appeared to be a standard rural construction project. Inside, it served as the entry point for an extraordinary engineering project. Beginning in late 2014, a crew of professional miners, structural engineers, and laborers brought in from Sinaloa began digging straight down. They excavated a vertical shaft over 30 feet deep beneath the floorboards of the cinder block house, reaching a depth where the soil was dense enough to support a horizontal tunnel without collapsing. Working 24 hours a day in rotating shifts, the team dug toward cell 20 using heavy-duty electric jackhammers, hydraulic equipment, and precise GPS guidance systems. To power the heavy machinery without drawing attention, the cartel installed industrial diesel generators inside the cinder block shed, disguising the noise as routine agricultural work. The technical scale of the tunnel was astonishing, stretching precisely 1.5 kilometers, nearly a full mile. It was carved over 30 feet beneath the surface to bypass the prison's underground motion sensors and deep concrete foundations. The shaft was roughly 6 feet high and nearly 3 feet wide, allowing a tall man to walk through without stooping. To prevent cave-ins from the massive weight of the ground above, the miners reinforced the entire length of the tunnel with solid wooden beams, steel supports, and industrial PVC piping. Furthermore, the tunnel was built with high-tech amenities. The miners installed a continuous plastic ventilation line connected to high-powered air pumps at the surface, ensuring a steady stream of fresh oxygen throughout the subterranean corridor. Electric power lines were strung along the ceiling to operate bright LED lighting systems along the entire route. The primary innovation, however, was the transport system. The cartel engineers modified a standard German motorcycle, mounting it onto custom steel rails fixed to the concrete floor of the tunnel. The motorcycle was converted to run on a modified engine system and fitted with front and rear carts to carry heavy sacks of dirt during construction, and to transport Chapo at high speeds once the tunnel was complete. Over the course of nearly a year, workers hauled out over 3,200 tons of dirt, dumping the soil inside the abandoned cinder block building and spreading it across the surrounding fields at night. While his team worked tirelessly beneath the earth, Chapo played his part inside cell 20. He kept a quiet, predictable routine, never causing trouble for guards and strictly following prison schedules. to hide the loud noise of the jackhammering as the tunnel approached the prison floor. Chapo's legal team repeatedly complained about the noise from television sets in the day room, keeping ambient volume levels high. By early July 2015, the mining crew reached the base of Altiplano. Using precise satellite coordinates, they dug straight up into the blind spot of Cell 20, the private shower stall. Because of privacy regulations, the shower area was separated by a knee-high concrete partition, leaving a small floor area hidden from the direct line of sight of the overhead security camera. On the night of Saturday, July 11, 2015, the trapdoor was ready. At 8:45 p.m., prison surveillance footage showed Chapo pacing back and forth inside Cell 20. He wore his standard gray inmate uniform. He walked over to his bunk, retrieved a small electronic tablet, and moved toward the shower partition. He knelt behind the low concrete wall, seemingly checking something near the floor. Beneath the shower, the miners broke through the final layer of concrete. A rectangular section of the shower floor, measuring roughly 20 by 20 inches, dropped downward into the dark abyss. At 8:52 p.m., Chapo bent down, stepped through the hole in the floorboards, and disappeared into the floor. He dropped down a short ladder into a vertical concrete shaft, where two tunnel workers were waiting with a fresh set of clothes, civilian shoes, and a helmet. Chapo climbed onto the modified motorcycle mounted on the rail track. Within minutes, the driver revved the engine, speeding through the lit, ventilated mile-long tunnel toward freedom while guards just 50 feet above were completely unaware. Back inside Cell 20, the camera recorded 20 minutes of silence. When guards finally became suspicious of his prolonged absence from the frame, two officers walked down the corridor and called his name through the steel door. Receiving no answer, they unlocked the cell and looked behind the shower wall. They were met with a gaping hole in the concrete floor, a faint smell of motor oil and earth, and a ladder leading down into the darkness. Chapo emerged into the cinder block house in Santa Juana, where his sons and top lieutenants were waiting with armored vehicles. Before the alarm fully sounded across the prison complex, Chapo was driven to a nearby rural airstrip. There, he boarded a small private plane that flew him straight back into the rugged, familiar peaks of the Sierra Madre. The news broke globally early the next morning, sending shockwaves through international law enforcement and political circles. President Enrique Peña Nieto, who was on an official state visit to France at the time, called the escape an affront to the Mexican state. For the second time in his life, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman had walked out of a high-security prison, completely embarrassing the Mexican federal government and making global headlines. In Washington, D.C., American officials were furious. U.S. law enforcement agencies had repeatedly warned Mexico that Chapo was an extreme escape risk and had pressed for his immediate extradition to the United States. Now, the man who had overseen a global drug empire was free once more, back in the safety of his mountain stronghold, leaving the Mexican judicial system humiliated on the world stage. Chapo's July 2015 escape solidified his status as an almost mythical figure, capable of defeating any wall or wire placed in his way. But while the Kingpin celebrated his return to the Golden Triangle, the escape triggered the most intense, aggressive, and relentless international manhunt in history. The Mexican government, desperate to reclaim its lost credibility, mobilized the full power of its elite military forces. The clock was already ticking on Chapo's short-lived freedom. Following his miraculous July 2015 escape from the Altiplano high-security prison, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman felt invincible. For the second time in his life, he had made a total mockery of the Mexican judicial system and the international law enforcement agencies that hunted him. Safe within his traditional mountain territory in the Sierra Madre, surrounded by hundreds of heavily armed hitmen, and protected by an airtight network of local informants, Chapo believed no force on earth could touch him yet. As is so often the case with men who achieve absolute power and mythic fame, Chapo's ultimate vulnerability was not a military weakness or a rival cartel's bullet. It was his own ego. Chapo had long been obsessed with how the world viewed him. He knew that his life was the stuff of legends. The poor farm boy from Tuna who grew up selling oranges, rose to build a multi-billion-dollar global drug empire, outsmarted rival cartels, and escaped from 2 maximum security prisons. While local bands constantly sang his praises in narco corridos, Chapo wanted something bigger. He wanted a major Hollywood movie produced about his life, a grand biographical film that would immortalize his legacy alongside cinematic icons like Godfather Vito Corleone or Pablo Escobar. He was also deeply distrustful of commercial publishers and major film studios in the United States and Europe. He believed that American filmmakers would portray him as a mindless monster or a violent brute. He wanted total control over the narrative. He wanted a film that showcased his intelligence, his humble origins, his generosity to the poor, and his defense of his people to bring his Hollywood dream to life. Chapo turned to a person he had admired from afar for years. Mexican actress Kate del Castillo was one of Mexico's most famous television stars, best known for her lead role in the wildly popular telenovela La Reina del Sur, the Queen of the South, in which she played a fictional female drug kingpin running an international smuggling empire. Back in 2012, while Chapo was still a fugitive following his first prison escape, Del Castillo had published a controversial post on Twitter. In her message, she expressed deep disillusionment with the Mexican government and wrote that she trusted Chapo Guzman more than the corrupt politicians who govern the country. She famously urged him to use his vast wealth and power to traffic in good deeds rather than drugs. Chapo had been mesmerized by her words. Through his lawyers, he sent her flowers and a personal letter thanking her for her support. After Chapo was arrested in Mazatlán in 2014, his legal team re-established contact with Del Castillo. Chapo formally granted her the exclusive legal rights to produce his official movie biography, trusting her completely to guard his legacy. When Chapo escaped from Altiplano through the mile-long tunnel in July 2015, the movie project suddenly took on urgent momentum. Chapo's lawyers reached out to Del Castillo again, offering to set up a secret face-to-face meeting with the Kingpin in the mountains. At the same time, Oscar-winning American actor and director Sean Penn entered the picture. Penn learned about Del Castillo's unique connection to Chapo through mutual acquaintances in the film industry. Seeing a historic journalistic opportunity, Penn proposed traveling with Del Castillo into the Mexican jungle to interview Chapo for Rolling Stone magazine. Del Castillo agreed to facilitate the meeting, believing it would help push her movie project forward and build momentum for the screenplay. Neither the actress nor the Hollywood star fully understood the massive digital net that American and Mexican intelligence agencies had cast over Mexico following Chapo's embarrassing escape from Altiplano. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration, the FBI, and the elite Mexican Navy, La Marina, had initiated the largest electronic surveillance operation in history. Mexican and American agents were actively intercepting thousands of phone calls, text messages, and emails across Mexico. The moment Chapo's lawyers began communicating via encrypted cell phones with Kate del Castillo to arrange the meeting, federal intelligence analysts picked up the signals. Chapo's Vanity had given the authorities the exact thread they needed to unspool his entire operation. On October 2, 2015, Sean Penn and Kate Del Castillo boarded a private charter plane in Los Angeles and flew to Guadalajara, Mexico. From there, they were met by Chapo's operatives, including his son, Alfredo Guzman. The actors were driven to a remote airstrip where they boarded two small propeller planes equipped with radar-dampening equipment. They flew deep into the Sierra Madre Mountains, landing at an isolated mountain strip near Pueblo Nuevo, on the border between Sinaloa and Durango. From the landing strip, they embarked on an exhausting 7-hour journey in a convoy of four-wheel drive trucks through dense jungle and over treacherous mountain roads. Unbeknownst to Penn, Del Castillo, or Chapo's men, American spy satellites and Mexican military intelligence units were tracking the convoy's movements. Late that evening, the convoy arrived at a secluded mountain resort surrounded by heavily armed cartel gunmen carrying assault rifles and rocket launchers. There, in the dim light of the jungle clearing, stepped Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. He was dressed in a silk shirt and pressed pants, clean-shaven and smiling broadly. For 7 hours, Chapo hosted the Hollywood stars. He treated them to a lavish feast of tacos, tequila, and wine. He was warm, polite, and eager to impress Del Castillo, whom he treated with grand chivalry during their long conversation. Chapo spoke openly about his life, his childhood, and his massive criminal operations. Abandoning the public lies he had maintained for decades, Chapo proudly bragged to Penn about the true scale of his empire. "I supply more heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana than anybody else in the world," Chapo boasted openly. "I have a fleet of submarines, airplanes, trucks, and boats." Penn listened intently, asking about Chapo's childhood, his views on violence, and his thoughts on the global war on drugs. When Penn asked if he considered himself a violent man, Chapo replied smoothly, "Look, all I do is defend myself, nothing more. But do I start trouble? Never." Before the night ended, Penn requested a formal, on-camera interview. Chapo agreed to do it at a later date, to prove to his editors at Rolling Stone that the meeting had actually occurred. Penn insisted on taking a photograph. The resulting image, showing Sean Penn shaking hands with Chapo Guzman in front of a wood-paneled jungle wall, would soon become one of the most famous photos in modern crime history. As dawn approached at 4 a.m., Chapo embraced his guests, promised to continue working with Del Castillo on the movie script, and vanished into the thick jungle fog with his bodyguards. The meeting was a catastrophic tactical mistake for Chapo. The presence of international celebrities, their electronic devices, and the complex logistics required to move them across Mexico had blown his cover wide open just days after Penn and Del Castillo left the mountains. Elite Mexican Marines launched a massive, pre-dawn assault on Chapo's hideout in Mazatlán, Durango. Gunships hovered overhead, firing heavy-caliber rounds into the tree-lined. Chapo barely escaped the military dragnet, using a local woman and her young daughter as human shields to prevent the Marine helicopter gunships from opening fire directly on him. Chapo fled down a steep ravine, badly injuring his leg in a fall as he scrambled into the dense brush. The military captured several of his key lieutenants, seized his personal communications equipment, and recovered encrypted cell phones that contained a gold mine of operational intelligence. Chapo was on the run once again, injured, exhausted, and losing ground every single day. The vast protection network that had kept him safe for months was crumbling under the weight of continuous military raids triggered by the intelligence gathered around the meeting. On January 9, 2016, Rolling Stone published Sean Penn's explosive 10,000-word article titled "El Chapo Speaks." Attached to the article was a 17-minute video clip that Chapo had recorded on his phone and sent to Del Castillo weeks after their meeting. In the video, wearing a blue shirt and a black cap against a rural backdrop, Chapo answered Penn's questions, calmly admitting his role as the world's premier drug lord. The article caused an immediate global media sensation. Critics attacked Penn for granting a ruthless killer editorial approval over the story, while Mexican officials publicly stated that the secret meeting between the actors and the Kingpin had been essential to tracking Chapo down. Chapo had wanted a movie to showcase his invincible legend to the world. Instead, his overwhelming desire for Hollywood fame had handed his worst enemies the exact roadmap they needed to end his freedom forever. Driven out of his mountain fortress by constant military pressure, Chapo was forced to flee toward the coastal cities of Sinaloa, unaware that he was walking straight into a deadly trap. Hunted like an animal in the high peaks of the Sierra Madre following his ill-advised October 2015 meeting with Sean Penn and Kate Del Castillo, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman made a crucial tactical decision. The relentless military air raids, ground sweeps, and drone surveillance across Durango and Sinaloa had made life in his mountain camps unbearable. His legs were injured from a narrow escape down a steep ravine. His communications network was shattered, and the winter cold was setting in. Chapo decided to descend from his mountain fortress and head toward the coastal city of Las Machias. Located in northern Sinaloa, Las Machias was a bustling urban center, surrounded by flat agricultural land and connected directly to the Pacific coast. Chapo believed that the quiet, wealthy residential district of Scully would offer the perfect hiding spot. He assumed the military would still be combing the deep canyons of Badiraguato, expecting him to remain among his loyal mountain villagers by late December 2015. Chapo moved into a comfortable, two-story white house on Jiquilpan Boulevard. It was an unpretentious home, painted light beige with a white wrought iron garage door, sitting directly on a busy residential street. To the casual observer, it looked like the home of a successful local businessman or cattle rancher. However, true to Chapo's obsessive survival standards, the house was a heavily fortified safe house. Beneath a large mirror in a ground-floor dressing room, engineers had constructed a secret, steel-reinforced door operated by a hidden hydraulic switch. The door opened into a ladder shaft that dropped deep into the city's main underground storm drainage system. Furthermore, Chapo was not alone. He was guarded by his most trusted, lethal enforcer, Jorge Ivan Gastelum Avila, known universally as El Colo Ivan. Colo Ivan was a terrifying figure, a veteran cartel assassin, head of the Sinaloa cartel's regional hit squads, and a man who had previously escaped from prison himself. Along with Colo Ivan was a small team of heavily armed, battle-hardened bodyguards equipped with military-grade weaponry. Chapo believed he was completely invisible inside the Las Machias safe house. But the net had already closed. The breakthrough came through routine, meticulous police work combined with electronic surveillance. In early January 2016, federal intelligence agents monitored a suspicious delivery to the house on Jiquilpan Boulevard. An unusually large order of tacos delivered late at night by a fast-moving vehicle, along with a sudden spike in encrypted cell phone activity originating from the neighborhood. More importantly, Mexican naval intelligence, working in tight coordination with the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, D, and U.S. Marshals, confirmed that Colo Ivan, a high-value target in his own right, had been spotted in the immediate area. The Mexican Navy quickly mobilized its ultimate weapon, the Fuerzas Especiales FES, the elite special operations unit of the Mexican Marines. Codenamed Operación Cisne Negro, Operation Black Swan, the raid was meticulously planned down to the second. At 4:30 a.m. on Friday, January 8, 2016, total darkness hung over Las Mochis. A convoy of armored military vehicles silently surrounded the block on Jiquilpan Boulevard. Dozens of Marines, wearing black tactical gear, night vision goggles, and body armor, moved into position around the perimeter. The assault began with explosive violent force. A Marine breach team rushed the front entrance, using a heavy steel battering ram and explosive breaching charges to blow open the front door. The moment the door collapsed into the foyer, all hell broke loose inside the safe house. Chapo's bodyguards were fully awake and ready for war. They did not attempt to negotiate or surrender. From the top of the central staircase and behind reinforced interior walls, the cartel gunmen opened fire with automatic weapons. The narrow hallways of the house turned into a claustrophobic kill zone. Heavy 5.56 mm and 7.62 mm rounds tore through the drywall, shattering glass, pulverizing concrete, and filling the air with thick plaster dust and gun smoke. The cartel gunmen threw fragmentation grenades down the stairs, the explosions shaking the entire structure and blowing out the front windows. The entire firefight was captured on a Marine's helmet-mounted camera, creating raw, terrifying footage that would later be broadcast around the world. Breaching. Fire on the stairs. The Marine squad leader shouted through his radio as muzzle flashes lit up the dark, smoky corridors. One Marine was immediately hit in the shoulder by a high-velocity round and fell backward into the living room. His comrades quickly dragged him behind cover, returning fierce suppressor fire up the stairwell. The Marines systematically moved room to room, throwing flashbang grenades, clearing closets, and returning fire with overwhelming precision. For 15 agonizing minutes, the gun battle raged inside the house. 5 cartel bodyguards were killed in the intense close-quarters combat, and 6 others were wounded and captured. The Marines recovered a massive weapons cache from the bedrooms, including 2 Barrett .50 caliber anti-material sniper rifles capable of shooting through armored vehicles, grenade launchers, rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. While his men were dying on the staircase to buy him time, Chapo moved toward his escape route in the master bedroom. Chapo and Colo Ivan opened the hidden mirror door in the dressing room. They stepped inside, pulled the heavy steel door shut behind them, and descended 20 feet down a ladder into the pitch-black sewage network beneath Las Mochis. The storm drains were cold, filthy, and flooded with foul water reaching up to their knees. Chapo, wearing a dirty, sleeveless undershirt and dark jeans, waded through the dark tunnels alongside Colo Ivan. They walked for more than a mile beneath the city, completely bypassing the heavy military blockade surrounding the house on Jiquilpan Boulevard. Outside the house, as the sound of gunfire died down, the Marines searched every room. When they pulled open the secret mirror in the dressing room, they realized Chapo had slipped through their fingers once again. However, this time, the authorities were prepared for his subterranean tactics. Marine command posts immediately alerted ground patrols across the entire city to monitor every storm drain manhole cover within a 2-mile radius. About 90 minutes after the raid began, heavy rain began to fall over Las Mochis. The rising water levels inside the underground drainage pipes began to fill the narrow tunnels, making it impossible for Chapo and Colo Ivan to remain underground without drowning near the intersection of Jiquilpan Boulevard and 10 de Mayo Drive. About a mile and a half from the safe house, a heavy metal manhole cover suddenly pushed open from below. 2 soaked, filthy men emerged into the morning light. Chapo and Colo Ivan climbed out onto the pavement, wiping sewage from their faces. Desperate to leave the area before Marines spotted them, Colo Ivan flagged down a passing red Ford Focus at gunpoint, forcing the terrified driver out onto the street. They climbed into the stolen car and sped south toward the highway leading out of Las Machis. Unluckily for Chapo, the driver immediately reported the carjacking to a passing federal police cruiser. A statewide broadcast went out over police frequencies. Stolen red Ford Focus heading south on Highway 15. A few miles south of the city, near the small town of Juan Jose Rios, 2 Mexican federal police officers in a patrol car spotted the red Focus. They pulled up behind the vehicle, turned on their emergency lights, and forced the car to pull over onto the muddy shoulder of the highway. The police officers approached the vehicle with their pistols drawn. When they looked through the driver's side window, they froze sitting in the passenger seat, covered in mud and grease, wearing a filthy gray tank top, was the most wanted man on the planet. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. Chapo immediately attempted to do what had always worked for him throughout his long criminal career: use his vast fortune to buy his way out. "Look, officers," Chapo said smoothly, offering them cash, businesses, houses, and lifetime positions inside the Sinaloa cartel. "Leave me alone and you'll be set for life. You'll never have to work again." When the officers hesitated, Colo Ivan snapped, trying to intimidate them. But the officers stood their ground. Realizing that his bribes were failing, Chapo's demeanor suddenly shifted from polite desperation to cold fury. "You are all going to die," Chapo warned them, his eyes dark with menace. The officers knew that if they remained on the open highway, a heavily armed convoy of Sinaloa cartel hitmen would soon arrive to slaughter them and free their boss. Acting quickly, the officers snapped handcuffs onto Chapo and Colo Ivan, shoved them into the back of the patrol car, and snapped a quick photograph on a cell phone to send to their superiors as proof of the arrest. Instead of driving to a local police station, which could easily be stormed by cartel gunmen, the officers pulled into Hotel Du, a quiet roadside motel located on the outskirts of Las Machis. They led the handcuffed drug lord into Room 6, a simple, low-cost motel room with cheap floral bedsheets and yellow walls. They sat Chapo down on the edge of the bed to wait for military reinforcements. It was a bizarre, historic scene. The billionaire Kingpin, who had commanded vast armies, built cross-border empires, and escaped maximum security prisons, sitting quietly on a cheap motel bed in his dirty undershirt, guarding by 2 low-ranking police officers. A photograph taken inside Room 6 showed Chapo looking up at the camera with a tired, defeated expression, his hand resting under his chin. Realizing that his legendary run was finally over within minutes, heavy military helicopters roared overhead, landing directly in the motel parking lot. Dozens of Mexican Marines swarmed into Room 6, securing the perimeter and taking custody of the high-value prisoner. Later that afternoon, Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto took to Twitter to deliver the news to a waiting world. In a short, triumphant message that immediately went viral, he wrote, "Misión cumplida, lo tenemos." Mission accomplished, we have him. That evening, Chapo was flown by military aircraft to Mexico City. Under heavy guard, he was paraded once again in front of dozens of international news cameras at the federal hangar, dressed in a dark tracksuit, his mustache neatly trimmed. He was marched across the tarmac by 2 masked Marines who held him firmly by the neck. In an ultimate twist of irony, the Mexican government marched Chapo directly onto a military helicopter, bound for the exact same facility he had escaped from 6 months earlier. Altiplano high-security prison this time, however. There would be no third escape. The Mexican government had suffered enough humiliation on the world stage. The legal barriers that had protected Chapo from international prosecution were rapidly dismantled. The long, complex legal battle over his extradition to the United States was over. The net had finally closed, and the world's most infamous Kingpin was about to be handed over to the American justice system to face his ultimate reckoning. For a year after his dramatic recapture in the muddy streets of Las Machias, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman sat inside the high-security walls of Ciudad Juarez prison, watching his formidable legal armor strip away piece by piece. His lawyers filed dozens of appeals, constitutional motions, and delays to prevent his transfer to the United States. But the Mexican government, deeply scarred by two embarrassing prison escapes and facing massive international pressure, was no longer willing to take the risk. On January 19, 2017, on the final evening of Barack Obama's U.S. presidency, the legal appeals were officially exhausted. Mexican federal agents escorted Chapo from his cell, handcuffed him, and marched him onto a private jet bound for New York City. As the aircraft took off into the night sky, Chapo looked out the window, leaving his homeland behind for what would be the very last time. Late that night, the jet touched down at Long Island's MacArthur Airport. Chapo was handed over to a massive convoy of U.S. Marshals, DEA agents, and armored vehicles. They escorted him across the East River to the Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in Lower Manhattan, an infamous federal detention facility known for housing high-profile terrorism suspects and cartel bosses. The conditions awaiting him in Manhattan were unlike anything he had experienced in Mexico. There were no corrupt guards to bribe, no gourmet meals to order, and no wives or mistresses visiting his cell. Chapo was placed under special administrative measures, SAMs, inside a 10-by-17-foot cell in 10 South, the prison's most secure isolation unit. He was kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. The fluorescent light in his room stayed on around the clock. He was allowed no contact with the outside world, no phone calls, and no physical access to his family. The master of grand prison escapes was now trapped inside an impenetrable fortress of steel, concrete, and endless surveillance. On January 20, 2017, Chapo was escorted into the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn. Standing before U.S. District Judge Brian Cogan, the legendary Kingpin looked surprisingly frail in his dark prison jumpsuit. He pleaded not guilty to a 17-count federal indictment charging him with leading a continuing criminal enterprise, international drug trafficking, weapons offenses, and money laundering. The stage was set for one of the most sensational, expensive, and high-stakes criminal trials in American legal history. To ensure absolute security, the United States government launched an unprecedented security operation around the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse. Every day for 3 months, the Brooklyn Bridge was completely closed to public traffic so that a heavily armed convoy, complete with police cruisers, SWAT teams, bomb squad trucks, and helicopter escorts, could safely transport Chapo from his Manhattan prison cell to the courtroom in Brooklyn. Inside the courtroom, security was equally suffocating. Specially trained bomb-sniffing dogs swept the hallways every morning. Visitors, journalists, and spectators had to pass through 2 separate airport-style security checkpoints. Because of severe fears that the Sinaloa cartel might attempt to bribe, kidnap, or murder jury members, Judge Cogan ordered an anonymous, fully sequestered jury. The 12 jurors and 6 alternates were selected under complete anonymity, identified only by numbers, and escorted to and from the courthouse every day by heavily armed U.S. Marshals. The trial officially opened on November 13, 2018. Leading the prosecution was a formidable team of veteran federal attorneys, including Assistant U.S. Attorneys Richard Donahue, Andrea Goldberg, and Michael Purpura. They presented the jury with a staggering mountain of evidence collected over nearly 3 decades. Hundreds of intercepted phone calls, financial records, ledger books, satellite tracking data, and thousands of seized bricks of pure cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. To counter the government's overwhelming case, Chapo retained a high-profile criminal defense team led by attorneys Eduardo Balerzo, William Purpura, and the flamboyant Jeffrey Lichtman. The defense strategy was simple yet aggressive. They argued that Chapo was merely a scapegoat, a low-level operator used by the true mastermind of the Sinaloa cartel, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who had allegedly paid hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes to high-ranking Mexican officials to remain free, while Chapo took the fall. However, the core of the government's prosecution did not rest merely on physical evidence or legal arguments. It relied on the devastating testimonies of 14 cooperating witnesses, former cartel leaders, top lieutenants, chief accountants, logistics managers, and hitmen who had once been Chapo's closest friends and business partners. To secure reduced prison sentences for their own massive crimes, these men took the witness stand one by one, pointing their fingers directly at Chapo and exposing every dark secret of the Sinaloa cartel. The courtroom turned into a dramatic theater of betrayal. Among the most damaging witnesses was Jesus El Rey Zambada, the younger brother of El Mayo Zambada. Wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, El Rey spent days detailing the vast financial mechanics of the cartel. He explained how Chapo had imported hundreds of tons of Colombian cocaine via fishing boats, cargo ships, and private jets. El Rey stunned the court by detailing how the cartel spent tens of millions of dollars every month, bribing military commanders, federal police chiefs, and top political leaders across Mexico to secure safe passage for their drug shipments. Next came Miguel Angel Martinez, known as El Gordo, Chapo's former right-hand man and chief logistics director from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Martinez provided a mesmerizing look into the golden years of Chapo's rise. He testified about how Chapo used specialized cross-border smuggling tunnels disguised as a canned jalapeno pepper business, earning hundreds of millions of dollars in pure profit. Martinez described Chapo's unbelievable wealth during those years: private fleets of jets, sprawling ranches with personal zoos, gold-plated AK-47 assault rifles, and trips to Switzerland for high-tech skin rejuvenation treatments. Martinez also revealed the terrifying cost of disloyalty. He recounted how, after his arrest, Chapo had ordered 4 separate assassination attempts against him inside Mexican prisons, including a terrifying attack where hitmen threw hand grenades directly into his prison cell, while a brass band played outside to drown out the noise of the explosions. As the weeks dragged on, the testimonies grew increasingly brutal. Juan Carlos Ramírez Abadia, known as Chupeta, the former leader of Colombia's notorious Norte del Valle cartel, took the stand. Chupeta had altered his face through extensive plastic surgeries to evade law enforcement, giving him an eerie, unnatural appearance. He testified that his Colombian syndicate had supplied Chapo with over 400,000 kilograms of cocaine, praising Chapo's unmatched speed in moving drugs across the U.S. border. Then came the turn of Damaso López Núñez, known as El Licenciado, the former deputy director of the Puente Grande prison who had helped Chapo execute his famous 2001 laundry cart escape. Lopez later joined the Sinaloa cartel as Chapo's top lieutenant. Sitting just yards away from his former boss, Lopez testified about Chapo's ruthless violence, confirming that Chapo personally ordered the executions of rival cartel leaders, journalists, and police officers. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from Chapo's former chief hitman, Isaias Valdez Rios, known as Memon. He described scenes of unbelievable cruelty that Chapo personally carried out in his mountain hideouts. Valdez described how Chapo held two members of the rival Los Zetas cartel captive for days. Chapo personally beat the men with a thick wooden branch until their bones were broken, shot them in the head at point-blank range with a rifle, and ordered his men to throw their bodies onto a massive bonfire so no physical evidence would remain. On another occasion, Chapo personally shot a rival cartel member and ordered him buried alive while he was still gasping for air. Throughout these harrowing accounts of torture, murder, and corruption, Chapo sat quietly at the defense table. Dressed in dark suits, he rarely showed any emotion. He stared directly at his former allies as they testified against him, occasionally whispering to his defense team. The only moments Chapo appeared relaxed were when his wife, Emma Coronel, entered the courtroom. Dressed in designer outfits, Emma attended nearly every day of the trial, offering her husband silent nods and warm smiles across the crowded room. On January 31, 2019, after 11 weeks of explosive testimony, 66 witnesses, and hundreds of hours of evidence, the defense rested its case after calling only one minor witness. Chapo chose not to take the stand in his own defense. Closing arguments concluded, and the fate of the world's most famous Kingpin was handed over to the anonymous jury. For 6 long days, the jurors deliberated inside a private room, reviewing reams of financial documents, wiretap recordings, and witness transcripts. On the afternoon of Tuesday, February 12, 2019, the jury signaled that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom fell into dead silence as Judge Coggin took the bench. Chapo stood alongside his defense lawyers, looking toward the jury box. The jury foreperson read the decision aloud, guilty on all 10 federal counts. Chapo stood completely still, his face emotionless as the guilty verdicts echoed through the room. Guilty of operating a continuing criminal enterprise, guilty of conspiracy to distribute international narcotics, guilty of illegal firearms possession, and guilty of money laundering. Under federal mandatory sentencing guidelines, the verdict guaranteed that Joaquin El Chapo Guzman would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, with no possibility of parole. 5 months later, on July 17, 2019, Chapo returned to the Brooklyn courtroom for his official sentencing. Given a final chance to address the court, Chapo spoke through a Spanish interpreter for 15 minutes. Rather than expressing remorse for his decades of drug trafficking, murder, and devastation, he used his speech to denounce the conditions of his pretrial confinement in Manhattan, calling his 2 years in solitary confinement mental, emotional, and psychological torture. He accused the American judicial system of being corrupt and unfair. Judge Coggin showed no sympathy. The mountain of evidence was overwhelming, Coggin stated firmly. There was a broad line of human suffering associated with the defendant's actions. Judge Coggin pronounced the final sentence, life in prison plus 30 years. In addition, the judge ordered Chapo to forfeit $12.6 billion in illegal drug profits, the conservative estimate of the gross earnings his narcotics empire had generated over 3 decades. As U.S. Marshals placed heavy steel handcuffs back onto his wrists, Chapo turned toward Emma Coronel in the gallery, placed his hand over his heart, and blew her a quiet kiss. She nodded back through tears as her husband was led through the side door. The grand, bloody narrative of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman had reached its legal conclusion. The myth of the untouchable mountain king who could outsmart every government and escape every prison had finally shattered against the hard concrete of American federal justice. Within hours of his sentencing, A high-security military aircraft was prepared to fly Chapo to his final, permanent home, a place from which no inmate had ever escaped. The high-altitude air of the high plains of Colorado is thin, cold, and dry. Surrounded by snow-capped mountains and miles of empty brushland, the United States Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, known universally as ADX Florence, or the Alcatraz of the Rockies, stands as the ultimate terminus of the American federal penal system. Built in 1994, the facility was designed with a single, uncompromising purpose: total physical containment, absolute psychological isolation, and complete elimination of human contact. No inmate has ever escaped from ADX Florence. It is an architecture engineered specifically to render a human being invisible to the world. On July 19, 2019, 2 days after receiving his mandatory life sentence plus 30 years in a Brooklyn courtroom, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was flown under heavy armed guard to Colorado and delivered into the silent, concrete jaws of ADX Florence for a man who spent decades moving through the vast, open mountain ranges of the Sierra Madre, controlling private fleets of jetliners, directing armies of heavily armed sicarios, and living in opulent luxury safe houses. The transition to ADX Florence was an absolute collapse of reality. Chapo was assigned a cell measuring 7 by 12 feet, constructed entirely of poured, reinforced concrete. Inside sits a concrete bed topped with a thin mattress, a concrete desk with a concrete stool fixed to the floor, a combination stainless steel sink and toilet, and a small shower equipped with a timer that automatically shuts off the water after a few minutes. A single narrow window, 4 inches wide and 4 feet tall, angled directly upward toward the sky, offers a tiny slice of white cloud or blue atmosphere. It is angled in such a way that the inmate cannot see the ground, the perimeter fences, the surrounding landscape, or any other part of the prison facility. The occupant cannot orient himself toward the horizon or know where he is located within the complex under the strict special administrative measures, SAMs, imposed by the U.S. Department of Justice. Chapo is held in solitary confinement for 22 to 23 hours a day. For 1 hour each day, he is escorted in heavy leg irons, handcuffs, and belly chains by multiple guards to an individual outdoor cage, a concrete pit surrounded by towering walls and topped with thick steel mesh, where he can walk in circles alone under the sky. He never sees another inmate. He never hears another human voice except for the brief, procedural commands of the corrections officers who pass his meals through a narrow slot in his double-thick steel door. There are no corrupt guards to bribe with stacks of US dollars. There are no laundry carts to slip into, no maintenance workers to recruit, and no team of engineers digging a mile-long tunnel with ventilating pipes and a modified motorcycle beneath his shower floor. The steel doors are controlled electronically from remote control centers, protected by multi-layered biometric security, motion sensors, laser grids, and heavily armed towers overlooking perimeter walls lined with razor wire and patrol dogs. At ADX Florence, technology and design have systematically stripped away every weakness that Chapo had exploited in Mexican maximum security institutions. The silence inside the facility is absolute and heavy. In legal filings and handwritten letters addressed to Judge Brian Cogan and federal prison officials over the years following his imprisonment, Chapo's defense attorneys outlined the severe physical and psychological toll of this existence. They documented that the former Kingpin suffered from chronic headaches, memory loss, depression, severe insomnia, and constant auditory hallucinations, brought on by total sensory deprivation. He complained that the artificial fluorescent lighting inside his cell was kept on for long stretches, ruining his sleep cycle, and that he was denied access to radio, television, or Spanish-language newspapers. The man who once ruled an international narcotics empire spanning 4 continents found his entire world reduced to 4 gray walls and a 4-inch strip of sky. In the years following his permanent incarceration, Chapo launched several legal appeals seeking a new trial or a transfer back to Mexico, claiming that his extradition had been unlawful and that his conditions of confinement constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Each motion was methodically, systematically evaluated and rejected by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and the federal district courts, which ruled that the evidence against him was undeniable and that his conviction would stand without exception. While Chapo sat trapped in concrete silence, the world he left behind did not pause, nor did the global drug trade slow down the long-cherished myth promoted by law enforcement agencies, that removing the ultimate kingpin would shatter the cartel and cripple the movement of illegal narcotics, proved to be an illusion. The Sinaloa cartel was never a rigid, military-style dictatorship with a single commander whose removal causes the entire apparatus to collapse. It had always functioned as a federation of powerful criminal factions, sharing intelligence, logistics, smuggling channels, and bribed political networks while operating with considerable independence following Chapo's extradition. Power within the Sinaloa cartel split along volatile fault lines. On one side stood Chapo's longtime partner and co-founder, the veteran strategist Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who had successfully operated in the shadows for over 4 decades without ever being captured. On the other side emerged Chapo's sons, collectively known as Los Chapitos, led by Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, and Ovidio Guzman Lopez. Younger, bolder, and vastly more aggressive than their father's generation, Los Chapitos rapidly adapted to the changing demands of the illicit drug market. Recognizing the shifting dynamics of global addiction, they pivoted the cartel's primary focus away from traditional plant-based narcotics like plant-harvested cocaine and Mexican-grown heroin toward synthetic drugs, most notably fentanyl. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times more potent than heroin, transformed the financial landscape of organized crime. It required no vast fields of opium poppies, no agricultural labor, no dependence on weather cycles, and no months of cultivation. Using chemical precursors imported from industrial chemical suppliers in East Asia, the cartel set up small, easily concealed laboratories hidden in urban houses, warehouses, and rural ranches across Sinaloa. The profit margins were staggering, far exceeding anything Chapo had achieved during his golden era in the 1990s and 2000s. A few $1,000s worth of imported chemical precursors could be converted into millions of synthetic pills, driving a devastating public health crisis across the United States and generating billions of dollars in revenue for the new generation of traffickers. With this shift came a terrifying escalation of violence. The fragile internal harmony that Chapo and El Mayo had maintained for decades dissolved into chaotic factional warfare. Los Chapitos clashed violently, not only with rival organizations like the rapidly expanding Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, led by Nemesio Oscar Cervantes, El Mencho, but eventually with the old guard factions loyal to El Mayo Zambada. In October 2019, just 3 months after Chapo was sentenced to life in prison, the city of Culiacan became a war zone during an event known as El Culiacanazo, when Mexican federal forces temporarily captured Chapo's son, Ovidio Guzman Lopez, at a residential compound. Hundreds of heavily armed Sinaloa cartel gunmen flooded the streets. Armed with high-caliber machine guns, armored vehicles, and rocket-propelled grenades, they blockaded city entrances, burned vehicles, took military personnel hostage, and opened fire on government buildings. Facing the immediate threat of widespread civilian slaughter, the Mexican government made the controversial decision to release Ovidio to prevent a bloodbath, a stark demonstration that despite Chapo's imprisonment, the criminal infrastructure he built still possessed the firepower to hold an entire state capital hostage eventually. However, the net closed on the second generation as well. After years of intense multi-agency intelligence operations, Ovidio Guzman Lopez was recaptured in January 2023 following a violent military raid in Sinaloa and subsequently extradited to the United States to face federal charges in Chicago. Yet, the removal of individual leaders continued to follow the same predictable historical pattern. New lieutenants immediately filled the vacuum, laboratories kept running, and the supply of narcotics flowing across international borders remained uninterrupted. The story of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman is ultimately a dark chronicle of power, violence, and institutional failure. His trajectory, from an illiterate boy working in the isolated, poverty-stricken poppy fields of Tuna, to the undisputed kingpin of a global criminal empire, was enabled at every stage by systemic poverty, global consumer demand for illicit drugs, and deep corruption spanning governments and law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border for decades. His name was spoken across Mexico with a mixture of terror, awe, and fascination. He became the subject of popular folk ballads, narco-corridos, a mythical figure who repeatedly outsmarted federal armies, constructed impossible escape routes, and built an empire that rivaled legitimate multinational corporations. Yet, stripped of the romanticized myths and cinematic lore, his true legacy is written in blood, suffering, and destruction. His decades-long fight for narco supremacy left tens of thousands of people dead across Mexico: rivals, police officers, journalists, political candidates, and innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of cartel wars. His vast distribution networks funneled hundreds of tons of addictive poisons into communities across North America and Europe, destroying millions of lives and destabilizing entire regions. Today, in the deep silence of the Colorado mountains, the myth has dissolved into stark, inescapable reality. The man who once held the power of life and death over thousands, who commanded armies of sicarios with a nod, and who lived in the shadows of luxury hideouts, now lives out his remaining days as inmate number 89,914 to 053. There are no interviews, no Hollywood movies to direct, no secret meetings in the jungle, and no tunnels to dig. There is only the continuous hum of fluorescent lights, the cold touch of poured concrete, the routine passage of tray slots through a heavy steel door,